Dear friends, the Pyramid of Khufu has long attracted the attention of a huge number of people with its mysteries. And one of the most interesting mysteries on this list is the fact that it is still absolutely unclear how this ancient structure was built. The question of how all these millions of tons of blocks could have been lifted up is asked by thousands of researchers around the world, from professional Egyptologists to simple amateurs. I will also try to contribute to the study of this fascinating topic. And in this video, over the next 40 minutes, I will try to explain to you the essence of my hypothesis about how the most famous pyramid in the world was built. Despite the fact that official Egyptology, as a separate scientific direction, has existed for a couple of centuries, we still do not have a generally accepted theory explaining how the pyramids of the 4th dynasty and the Khufu pyramid in particular were built. Of course, a huge number of hypotheses have been put forward. Herodotus wrote about the use of wooden levers located on the stepped edges of the pyramid. All possible versions of an external ramp have been proposed, although no traces of such a structure have been found near the Khufu pyramid. The idea has been put forward that the king's chamber is a kind of cabin in an elevator shaft, which was lowered down after construction, and the real burial chamber is located underneath. There is a theory of a water elevator, according to which the blocks were given positive buoyancy and they rose along a water pipe. And of course, various options for lifting the blocks along the faces of the pyramid itself were considered. Specialists calculated what weights could be lifted in this way and what efforts were required for this. French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed the idea of an internal spiral ramp and a method of lifting heavy granite blocks using a counterweight moving along the Grand Gallery. His theory is currently considered one of the most elaborate. Without a doubt, all of these hypotheses have a right to exist, and the ideas proposed in them deserve consideration. However, many of them are largely speculative and rely more on the abstract thoughts of the authors about the hypothetical capabilities of the pyramid builders than on real facts. And this is the distinctive feature of the idea that I want to offer you. As you will see later, my hypothesis is based from beginning to end on the information we have about the Khufu pyramid and other pyramids, on specific details and facts. Of course, this does not mean that we can do without assumptions and guesses. Nevertheless, all further reasoning will be based primarily on details and real information, and only secondarily on abstract logic and speculation. And how reasonable and rational these arguments are, you, as always, will be able to decide for yourself. But I am almost certain of one thing. After watching this video to the end, you will be very surprised at how many important conclusions can be made and how much information can be obtained based on the data that you and I already have on hand. We just need to collect them all together and look at them more closely. Drawing of the Khufu pyramid. I think this scheme is well known to you. The entrance to the pyramid is on the north side. The descending corridor leads to the underground chamber. The ascending corridor leads to the so-called Queen's Chamber. And if you continue moving up the Grand Gallery, you get to the King's Chamber. The upper chambers have a pair of inclined shafts, which I talked about in detail in previous videos. The shafts starting from the King's Chamber reach the surface of the pyramid, and the shafts going from the Queen's Chamber end with plugs and for some reason do not reach the surface. The purpose of these channels is still debated. There are two main versions. The first comes down to the ritual and religious purpose of the shafts. Allegedly, the soul of the pharaoh flew to the stars through them. The second version is more pragmatic. According to it, these shafts are ventilation channels. This is how the upper shafts are used today after they have been cleaned and equipment for forced ventilation has been installed. But we won't dwell on that now. Instead, let's take a closer look at the trajectory of these channels. you'll soon see that they can tell us much more than meets the eye. And these trajectories will be the starting point of our journey in search of the secret of the construction of the Great Pyramid. First of all, let's look at these shafts from above. We see that for some reason, they all start almost in the same vertical plane. And then the northern shafts deviate 5 meters to the west and again go almost one under the other to the north. This shift can be explained by the fact that the builders thus bypassed the Grand Gallery. There were also suggestions that such a shift was excessive for this purpose, and the shafts bypassed some other hidden room. Jean-Pierre Houdin even suggested that hidden chambers with a false vault, similar to the antechambers in the Red Pyramid, could be located parallel to the Grand Gallery. I am sure that this assumption is wrong, and we will return to the meaning of this maneuver of the northern shafts. But for us, first of all, it is important to understand why all the shafts start in this place, in the same vertical plane, and why they tend to go one under the other. After all, there are more than 20 meters between them vertically. And when the upper shafts were created, the lower ones had long been covered with masonry from above. What could be the reason for such a dependence? Moreover, if it was initially clear that it would be necessary to bypass the Grand Gallery, why not start the northern shafts further west? Or why couldn't all the shafts be moved to the west, thereby eliminating the difficulties with the turn, which was technologically not easy to implement? The answers to these questions, in my opinion, are key to understanding what happened during the construction of the Khufu pyramid. But how can we get them? First of all, let's think about what we know about the construction of the pyramids of the 4th dynasty. The structure of their interiors has been studied, but what is inside the masonry is unknown. It is impossible to disassemble them. Scanning gives only blurry images that allow us to roughly determine hidden cavities, but neither their exact parameters nor their exact purpose can be determined in this way. It turns out that the study of the pyramids has reached a dead end, and it is not very clear how to move forward in this situation. But there is still a way out, and we can look at the construction site of the creators of the pyramids. And 2 pyramids attributed to the 4th dynasty will help us with this. The first of them is the unfinished pyramid in Zawiat El Aryan, the construction of which was interrupted at the excavation stage. Judging by the size of its perimeter, if it had been completed, it could have been comparable in height to the Pyramid of Khufu on the Giza Plateau. The second is the Pyramid of Djedefre in Abu Rawash. It was most likely completed, but then completely dismantled. The quarrying of stone at the site of its construction lasted for many centuries, and now only a pit remains. So in fact, we have 2 construction sites that provide us with invaluable information about how the Egyptian pyramids were built. What can we learn from studying them? A lot of important things, actually. First of all, look at how similar the silhouettes of these pits are. It is obvious that they were created according to the same pattern, although they have different sizes. In both cases, we see 2 elements. The first is the main part of the pit, which has a rectangular shape. It was intended for the construction of the chamber. The second element is a narrow trench with almost vertical walls, at the bottom of which there is a descending ramp. Along this ramp, there was supposed to be a corridor. And here it is necessary to pay attention to a couple of very important points. Firstly, the descending ramp in both pyramids does not go to the center of the pit, but is shifted to the east, and the western wall of the ramp, accordingly, divides the larger side of the pit into almost 2 equal parts. Secondly, these pits have another common feature, the same width of the ramps. It is equal to 5.5 meters. That is, we see obvious standardization. It is logical to assume that the creators of the pyramids acted in this way because it was convenient for them. They knew a clear sequence of actions, and they had the knowledge and developed technologies for construction in such pits. And if so, then let's imagine that they used similar techniques in the construction of other pyramids. I think you will agree that this is logical. Let's return to the Khufu pyramid and try to apply the knowledge we have just acquired. The Queen's Chamber. We know that a horizontal corridor leads into it. Let's assume that it was also created in the same way as the corridors of the pyramids we have just examined. That is, in a vertical trench 5.5 meters wide. Let's just mark its dimensions on the drawing. Look, it immediately becomes clear why the northern shaft from the Queen's Chamber goes exactly here. It was simply built along the edge of this trench. And then it is extremely logical to assume that this trench continued on the southern side, and both southern shafts are laid along its western wall. That is why all the shafts begin in the same vertical plane, and that's why they are laid almost one under the other. It is not a matter of sacred geometry, cult expediency, or perfectionism of the builders. Everything is much simpler and more rational, and such a choice of shaft trajectories is explained by the construction technology. And if so, then this gives us the key to understanding how the pyramid itself was built. To take the next step and test our hypothesis, we need to understand how the main part of the pit for the Queen's Chamber is located. This part, as we know, must have a rectangular shape, and it turns out to be very simple. Look at the drawing. It shows how the blocks through which the inclined shafts pass are located. The main part of the shafts is created in blocks laid parallel to the direction of the channels, but in the lower part, the blocks are located vertically, and we can simply visually determine the size of our pit. Based on the drawing, the distance from the wall of the chamber to the wall of the pit is approximately 6 meters. For those who find my arguments not entirely convincing, the builders of the pyramid left a couple more clues. In the eastern wall of the Queen's Chamber, we see a niche of a strange shape. Egyptologists believe that a statue of the pharaoh was in it. Let's not argue with them. What is behind it is much more important to us. And behind it, there is a tunnel approximately 5 meters long. It is believed that this tunnel was closed by a wall block that was broken through by robbers. The same robbers allegedly broke the tunnel further, trying to find treasures. We will not dwell on this interesting story and guesses about the real purpose of this tunnel. But thanks to all these actions, we now know for sure that the precise laying of blocks goes exactly 6 to 7 meters deep, and then there are much more roughly processed blocks, which just confirms our assumption. And there is another interesting point. Look, the scheme clearly shows a break in the masonry of the corridor exactly at the point of the supposed junction of the main part of the pit and the vertical trench. The creators of the drawing even highlighted it in color, emphasizing its significance. Moreover, the evenly laid floor of the corridor ends exactly in this place. In the chamber itself and the adjacent section of the corridor, there are no floor blocks. That is, in this place, we see clear signs of the junction of two stages of construction. And now let's display the dimensions we found on the drawing. Look at the profile of the pit and vertical trench we propose. You must admit, it is a very familiar picture, which leaves little doubt that we are on the right track. And what about the King's Chamber? We do not see vertical masonry in the shafts next to it, but even here we can easily determine the required dimensions of the construction site since the lower part of the shafts is not quite level. Already from this uneven part, we can roughly estimate the dimensions of the main part of the pit, but everything becomes much simpler if we look at the plan from above. The leveled part of the northern shaft begins 7 meters from the wall of the chamber, and on the other side, at exactly the same distance, is the bend of the southern shaft. And from these points, we can confidently determine the edges of the pit. In my opinion, all the facts presented leave no doubt that both the Queen's Chamber and the King's Chamber were made using the same technique that we saw in the Zawiyat el-Aryan and Abu Rawash pyramids. That is, they were created using pits and ramps. But unlike these two pyramids, the pits and ramps in the Khufu pyramid were not cut into the bedrock, but were created from blocks directly in the masonry. But why? Why was this approach so convenient for the pyramid builders? It is time to find the answer to this most important question. The pyramids of Zawiyat el-Aryan and Abu Rawash have been described many times in literature. The history of their excavations is well known. We know many facts about these pyramids from detailed reports, and fortunately, we have fairly accurate drawings of them. But here's what's interesting. Not a single author of the books and articles that I've read has asked the simplest question: how did the pyramid builders work with these pits at all? At first glance, the answer seems quite simple. The building materials were lowered down the descending ramp. Good. But what about after that? Once you lay the first rows of masonry and start building the descending corridor, the ramp will no longer be accessible. How to lower the blocks after that? The work has only just begun, and the logistics are already disrupted. You can't just lower all these blocks on ropes from above. There must be some simple and rational solution, and I think I know what it is. Look, after the descending corridor was created, a new ramp was laid on top of it, and then as the masonry rose, it was built up. In this way, a convenient route for delivering materials directly to the construction site was constantly provided. It is an extremely logical and very important assumption for us. But how can we verify it? The pyramid in Zawiyat el-Aryan will not help us here in any way, because they practically did not even start building it. We can only hope for the pit in Abu Rawash. Let's look at the photos from there. We are now standing at the beginning of the descent. Do you see these inclined lines? I think these are the traces of this second upper ramp. Here they are right in front of us, and traces of the extension of horizontal sections are also visible. Moreover, if we look from the side, we will notice that these lines do not go to the end of the trench. So, apparently, the builders made additional bevels, allowing them to more conveniently lower heavy blocks. And the ramp at some point could have had a complex shape. As a matter of fact, the original shape of the ramp in the Zawiyat el-Aryan pit confirms this idea. It can be further assumed that the space around the supposed chamber was intended for the construction of scaffolding, and the platform located along the perimeter of the upper part of the excavation was used to place rigging equipment. The same site exists in the Zawiyat el-Aryan pit. Now we have understood the basic algorithm of work in such pits. Its main feature and advantage is the fact that all building materials are not raised from below, but are supplied from above. Moreover, the heaviest blocks can be carefully lowered down the inclined surface almost directly to the installation site. The main part of the pit is gradually filled from the bottom up as the chamber is built, and the configuration of the descending ramp can be periodically changed for the convenience of moving the blocks. Once again, supply of building materials from above and stage-by-stage reconstruction of the ramp. I ask you to remember these two very important principles. Understanding them will greatly simplify our further work. Let's return to the Khufu pyramid. And before we begin the main stage of our reconstruction, it is necessary to focus on one more important point. If we look at the trajectories of the shafts coming out of the king's chamber from above, we will immediately see that they are not straight at all. They obviously have bending points and do not go strictly parallel to the north-south direction. How should this be understood? What is the reason for such apparent carelessness? Where has the religious perfectionism gone? with which Egyptologists so love to explain all the incomprehensible aspects of the construction of the pyramids. You can answer this by saying that these shafts go deep in the masonry of the pyramid, and no one except the soul of the pharaoh and modern robots could see them. So the builders in this case could have neglected their principles a little, and everything would be logical, if not for one nuance. If we look at these shafts in a lateral projection, we will see that, with the exception of the initial sections of the upper shafts, they all rise absolutely straight. That is, their angles of inclination are perfectly maintained. And this is very strange, since it is obvious that the direction along the sides of the pyramid was much easier to control than the angle of inclination. What could be the reason for such a weird situation? I am absolutely sure that there is no religious background here, and the only reason for such a precise angle of the shafts can only be the fact that they are laid on top of the ascending ramps. Only this could ensure such precision of the angles of inclination. That is, they are actually made on the principle of corridors, only much smaller. And as we have already understood, unlike the main corridors, they do not go along the center of the ramps, but along the edge of the vertical walls of the trench. And the precision of their laying, perhaps, was not particularly necessary. After all, the builders were quite satisfied with the carelessness with which they exit the king's chamber. But since they were then laid out on top of a flat ramp, such a precise angle of inclination was obtained simply automatically. And this is a very important assumption. If this is so, then another vertical trench ran from the western side, and the northern shafts, after being displaced, were laid on top of their ramps just along its wall. And then the deviation of the upper shafts in the projection from above immediately becomes clear. Compare it with the pit in Zawiat El Aryan. The width of the ramp there increases slightly as it rises, and if a similar shaft had been laid along it, it would also have deviated to the side. But in the pit in Abu Rawash, the width of the ramp is the same along its entire length, which does not suggest any deviation. And apparently we have the same situation for the lower inclined shafts. They go straight in the north-south direction. So everything fell into place. And now we have almost all the keys to understanding what happened inside the Khufu pyramid during its construction. Well then, it's time to put the pieces of the puzzle together. To understand the basic principle of the construction of the Khufu pyramid, we will skip the initial stage and go straight to the key phase. Obviously, this is the creation of the king's chamber, because the heaviest granite blocks had to be lifted specifically for the king's chamber and the unloading chambers above it. The weight of each such block is estimated at 60 tons. How did this happen? So we have a construction site where the king's chamber was being built. A ramp rises from below, on top of which the grand gallery will be built. And this ramp continues further to the south. When the builders raise its level even higher, just as they raise the level of the ramp in the Abu Rawash pit, the upper southern shaft will be laid along it, and earlier, the lower southern shaft was extended along the wall of this same trench. Similarly, a little to the west, another ramp begins to rise from the site of the king's chamber. After its level is raised, the upper northern shaft will be laid along it. The lower northern shaft, coming out of the queen's chamber, was previously moved into this same trench. And we only have to take one step and assume that this ramp continues downwards from the southern side. You may ask, what is this other lower ramp and where does it go? I'll tell you now. Jean-Pierre Houdin, in his theory of the construction of the Khufu pyramid, suggested that the Grand Gallery could have been used to move a counterweight that helped lift heavy blocks. As evidence, he cited the fact that at the bottom of the Grand Gallery, there are traces of repeated movement of something heavy. He also believes that the grooves along the walls of the gallery could have been used for wooden inserts that served as guides. And the cutout in the so-called grand step, which is no longer visible thanks to restorers, was used to smoothly move the ropes. This hypothesis, of course, has its own logic. But what path did the builders take to lift the blocks themselves? Jean-Pierre Houdin suggested the presence of an external ramp on the southern side of the pyramid, with the help of which the blocks were raised to a height of 43 meters. But since most of the heaviest granite blocks had to be delivered even higher, to the platform located above the king's chamber, he came up with this complex method. But I think it was much simpler and more elegant. There was no external ramp, only a system of internal ones. First, the blocks were raised to the platform of the king's chamber, and the easiest way to raise them there was to make a ramp absolutely symmetrical to the ramp of the grand gallery. Look where the beginning of this ramp comes in this case, right to the foot of the pyramid on the southern side. And the builders left us one clue to confirm this idea. If we look at the pyramid in lateral projection, we will see that exactly at the intersection of this supposed ramp and the lower southern shaft, this shaft has a defect, a lateral shift of the blocks. And this indirectly confirms the assumption that in this place the junction of two stages of construction took place. It turns out that we have two ascending ramps going towards each other in two parallel vertical trenches. And I think that the construction of the pyramid from the very beginning and almost to the end was accompanied by their alternate buildup, both for the construction site of the king's chamber and for the construction site of the queen's chamber. We can speak with a high degree of confidence about two iterations of the construction of these ramps. At first, they rose directly from the edge of the construction sites and then were built up higher. And the inclined shafts were laid exactly along these built-up ramps. At the same time, the presence of two ramps ensured the continuity of the work. While one of them was being built up, blocks continued to be moved along the other. Perhaps for now, this hypothesis seems somewhat speculative to you. Wait a bit, soon I will give serious arguments in its favor. And so, the blocks were raised to the platform of the king's chamber along the ramp going up from the southern side. The counterweight method proposed by Jean-Pierre Houdin could well have been used. And then the blocks were raised even higher along the upper ramps, southern or northern. A very simple scheme, no external ramps, almost optimal routes for delivering the blocks. And this scheme explains the trajectories of the inclined shafts very well. But at this point, an attentive viewer should say, "Stop, wait." It is clear how the load was lifted along the lower ramp. We can assume that the counterweight in the grand gallery worked. But what happened next? The builders couldn't have continued to drag the blocks by hand, could they? Of course they couldn't. And here is where the most interesting part begins. In order to explain one of the most important elements of my hypothesis, I will have to digress a little here and briefly retell what I described in detail in the previous video. At the bottom of the Grand Gallery is the so-called ascending corridor, and it has a very strange design. All the corridors in all Egyptian pyramids are made of blocks laid parallel to the direction of the corridor, and only the ascending corridor of the Khufu pyramid is not built like that. Its upper part is built in a standard way, but in the lower part, the blocks are laid absolutely differently. All attempts to explain this by the fact that it was at this point in time that the builders of the pyramid forgot how to build, and the necessary blocks of Tura limestone could not be delivered on time, do not stand up to criticism, since at the same time, the upper part of the descending corridor was being erected nearby, and it is built in a standard way with simply fantastic millimeter accuracy. But the most interesting thing is that in the middle of the ascending corridor, there are so-called girdle stones. These are vertical inserts consisting of two parts, and the corridor is literally cut through them. Many Egyptologists believe that these are power elements inserted to strengthen the masonry of the corridor. But in my opinion, it is quite obvious that they are too thin for this purpose. In addition, they are the same width and are located at almost the same distance from each other, which is not typical for Egyptian pyramids, whose builders always used blocks of different sizes. And there is another, even stranger circumstance. If we draw a horizontal line from the central axis of the pyramid to the cladding, the top stone will divide this line exactly in half. With an accuracy of several tens of centimeters, given that the length of the line itself is more than 100 meters. This cannot be a coincidence. That is, the builders clearly put a certain geometric meaning into the location of these inserts. Moreover, it is absolutely obvious to me that the order of laying the corridor blocks was changed because of these girdle stones. And when the corridor was created, these blocks were already standing, so they had to be cut through. Then the builders, where they could, placed the blocks in a standard way, and then they filled the remaining space. Moreover, judging by the blocks adjacent to the girdle stones, it is clear that these inserts most likely continue high up. And if we assume that they go to the end, then the places where they exit onto the surface of the pyramid exactly coincide with the place where the inclined shafts exit. And as I already said in the previous video, I am sure that this entire set of facts cannot be a coincidence. All that remains is to understand what functionality these vertical walls could have. And so, within the framework of the considered hypothesis about the method of construction of the Khufu pyramid, I would like to express the following assumption. What if these are elevator shafts, and between these guides, platforms with a counterweight moved, and the same elevators are on the southern side? Then it immediately becomes clear how the builders raised the blocks along the upper ramps, and why the inclined shafts go exactly where they go. The shafts were laid along the ramps, and the ramps go right to the upper points of the elevators. And immediately, a rational explanation is given to the fact that the lower inclined shafts coming out of the Queen's chamber do not reach the surface of the pyramid. The ramps along which they were laid reached exactly to the elevator shafts and did not go further. And then it becomes clear why the girdle stones were already there when the ascending corridor was created, and the builders had to cut through them. The shafts of these elevators were filled with blocks at a time when the main level of the pyramid was already much higher. That is, this part of the corridor was created much later than the upper part. Moreover, it should be noted that below the three smooth girdle stones that I have described, there is another one. It has an uneven shape. Perhaps it was split at some point, but it is clear that its side surface was vertical, and it is located at the same distance from the nearest stone, like all the others. Therefore, we can assume the presence of another shaft on the side. And this immediately explains the direction of the lower inclined channels. They, like the upper ones, were directed to the points of exit of the elevator shafts onto the surface of the pyramid in order to make the most of the opportunities for working with these elevators, and appreciate the versatility of the ancient builders' proposed solution. These elevators are multifunctional. They can help lift blocks along ramps. They can help lower heavy blocks directly at the moment of their installation. They can help move cargo in a horizontal plane. They can work in pairs. One goes up, the other goes down. And in this mode, they could work all the time as the pyramid was being built. Moreover, small loads did not even require a special counterweight. Several dozen people could stand on the platform. The load was lifted, and the workers walked up. Thus, it may well turn out that instead of a crowd of ancient Egyptians sweating their brows pulling millions of blocks up, as many Egyptologists have suggested, we have contented, athletic-looking workers working up an appetite before lunch. The location of these elevators was also not chosen by chance. Look, I have marked the segments of equal length with color. That is, the height of the shaft is just enough to pull the load along the inclined ramp. If the elevator were located closer to the foot of the pyramid, its height would not be enough. At the same time, the lower ramp rests against this shaft, and it would seem that it could also work with this elevator. But its height is not enough for this. This confirms the assumption about the third shaft, the height of which is exactly equal to the length of the lower ramp. The ramp itself did not reach it, but used the maximum amplitude of the counterweight movement. And it is necessary to note one more interesting point. If we draw a line along the lower southern ramp upwards, it will come right to the top point of the elevator, that is, where the upper northern shaft comes out onto the surface of the pyramid. Of course, this may be a simple coincidence, but still, this fact allows us to assume that the lifting of blocks along the lower ramp could also be carried out with the help of these elevators. And the angle of inclination of the upper northern shaft was chosen precisely with this in mind. Here, however, the question arises about the length of the ropes required for such an operation. But this is a completely separate topic which we will not touch on in this video. Let's return to the king's chamber. And so the order of its construction could have been as follows. After the level of the general masonry of the pyramid reached the level of the supposed gable roof, the lifting of all the main blocks of the casing, ceiling, unloading chambers, and roof began. They were raised first along the lower southern ramp to the chamber platform, and then along the upper ramps with the help of counterweights and side elevators even higher. They had to be lifted up, since, as we have previously found out, heavy blocks were fed from above. Then, the ramps were built up again in order to use the height of the elevators to the maximum, and the level of the main masonry was brought to their highest points, or maybe even higher. Then construction began on the platform itself, and the lower ramp was filled with masonry, since its further use turned out to be impossible. In the process of erecting the king's chamber, granite blocks were lowered down and installed in their places. And, most likely, the ramps were built up several more times for the convenience of feeding the heaviest blocks used for the unloading chambers. But we have no information about this. Thus, the principle of construction of the Khufu pyramid could have consisted of a step-by-step buildup of inclined ramps, which occurred simultaneously with the increase in the level of the main masonry. And we can even trace the main steps of this process. After all, we have another invaluable clue left by the builders of the pyramid. This is the size of the blocks of which the pyramid is built. This size decreases from the base to the top, but not uniformly. Here is a map of the heights of the rows of blocks. For ease of perception, local maximums of heights are highlighted in red. It is logical to assume that each such maximum corresponded to the next stage of building up the ramps, since the blocks at these moments were raised directly to the installation level, and they could be made heavier. And then the masonry of the pyramid was created from smaller blocks, since they had to be raised even higher in some less convenient way. And so the rows of blocks gradually decreased in height until the ramp was built up again. And now look, each ramp we assume approaches the elevator shafts in the red zones. This cannot be a coincidence, and this allows us to reproduce with a fairly high degree of confidence the sequence of the main stages of construction, starting almost from the very bottom. And this is very important because we have so far only analyzed the stage of construction of the king's chamber. but the configuration of the ramps during the construction of the Queen's Chamber was different. But this is already a topic for the next part, since the timing of this video has already dragged on. Of course, what I have just told you is a hypothesis that requires discussion and further development. However, as you can see, it is based not just on abstract conclusions, but relies on the analysis of information about the internal structure of the Khufu pyramid and explains many of its strange details and patterns. Moreover, it connects the technology of building the Khufu pyramid with the method of building the pyramids of Abu Rawash and Zawiyat el-Aryan. This seems very important to me because the Khufu pyramid is the most famous, but far from the only one of the great pyramids attributed to the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty. And it would be logical to assume that they were all built using similar methods. And I would like to finish this video, oddly enough, not on the Giza Plateau, but in Meidum. The Meidum pyramid has one peculiarity. On the upper 2 steps of its eastern face, there is a very strange trace, which is a vertical strip of blocks, as if slightly pressed into the body of the pyramid. The depth of this strip is only 2 to 3 centimeters, but under certain lighting it is clearly visible. Many Egyptologists assume that this is a trace left by an external ramp. Builders allegedly lifted blocks up this ramp. But there is one problem. The upper part of this pressed strip is slightly wider than the lower one. If this were an external ramp, then it should be exactly the opposite, because a ramp cannot widen upwards. Another mystery of the Egyptian pyramids, you say. I will not argue with you. But do you know how wide this strip is? 5.5 meters. And this fact allows us to assume that the Meidum pyramid may have used a construction principle similar to what we have just examined. So, it is quite possible that our journey to the time of the construction of the Great Pyramids is just beginning. Dear friends, write in the comments what you think about the hypothesis presented in this video. I also want to note that your questions and thoughts significantly help me in my work. And of course, if you like the video, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for your time and attention.